You've started to feel it again, that quiet, almost embarrassing flicker that something is about to shift. That after all of it, the waiting, the disappointments, the long stretch where nothing seemed to move no matter how hard you pushed, things might finally be turning in your direction. Part of you wants to lean into that feeling, and another part is already bracing because you've trusted hope before and watched it dissolve in your hands. So you keep the feeling at arm's length. You tell yourself not to jinx it, not to get carried away, not to be the fool who believed too early. But it keeps returning anyway, this stubborn sense that the ground beneath your life is rearranging itself into something you can't quite see yet. Carl Jung would tell you that feeling is worth paying attention to, because in his years of sitting with people at the lowest points of their lives, he noticed something strange. The sense that things are about to change often arrives before there's any visible reason to believe it. And more often than the rational mind would ever allow, that sense turned out to be right. He didn't think this was magic. He didn't think the universe was sending signals or that positive thinking was bending reality to someone's will. What he found was stranger and, honestly, more useful. He came to believe that the psyche registers change before consciousness can name it. The way animals grow restless hours before a storm the sky hasn't yet announced. Something in you knows the weather is turning. You just don't have the words for it yet. Picture someone standing behind a loom while a tapestry is being woven. From where they stand, all they can see is chaos. Loose threads hanging everywhere, knots, colors that don't seem to belong together, a tangle with no discernible shape. If that were all you ever saw, you'd swear the whole thing was a mistake. But step around to the front, and a picture is forming. Deliberate, coherent, more beautiful than the mess behind it ever suggested. You are standing behind the loom right now, and the tangle you're staring at, the part that looks like nothing is coming together, is the underside of something being made. Today, I want to walk you through what Jung actually discovered about this threshold, the strange stretch of time right before a life turns. Why the feeling that everything is about to work out is real information rather than wishful thinking. Why it arrives while things still look bleak. Why the change, when it finally comes, almost never looks the way you imagined it would. And what your only real job is during this in-between, when you can feel the shift coming but can't yet prove it's real to anyone, including yourself. Because if you're sensing it, that low hum underneath your ordinary days that something is beginning, there's a good chance you're not being naive. You might be perceiving something that's already true and hasn't surfaced yet. Let's start with why the feeling shows up at all, because this is where most people get it wrong. When we imagine our lives improving, we picture it as an external event. The job offer arrives, the relationship appears, the money comes through, the diagnosis reverses. We think everything working out means the outer circumstances finally line up in our favor, and we wait, scanning the horizon for the evidence that our luck has changed. Jung looked at it from the opposite direction. He spent a great deal of his life studying how the inner world and the outer world talk to each other, and he became convinced that big external changes are usually preceded by big internal ones. Before your circumstances shift, something shifts inside you. A reorganization happens beneath your awareness, quietly, in the dark. And the first thing you feel of it is that unexplainable sense that change is near. So the feeling isn't the fantasy of a good outcome. It's the aftershock of something that has already begun to move. He described the unconscious as a vast, active workshop that never stops running. While your conscious mind is busy worrying, planning, replaying old arguments, and rehearsing conversations that will never happen, another part of you is working on the actual problem. It's sorting through everything you've lived, every dead end, every loss, everything you learned the hard way, and it's arranging all of it into a new configuration. You don't get to watch this happen. You only get the results. And sometimes, right before the results arrive, you get a premonition of them. Think about how often a solution comes to you in the shower, or on a walk, or in the first blurry seconds after you wake. You weren't consciously working on it. If anything, you'd given up. And then it just surfaces, fully formed, as if someone else had been laboring over it while you slept. That someone else, Jung would say, is you. The deeper, larger part of you that never stopped working, even when your conscious mind declared the situation hopeless. Now scale that up from a single problem to an entire life. That same process happens on the largest possible level. When your life reaches a point where the old way of living has clearly stopped working, where the strategies that used to carry you keep failing, where the doors keep closing, your unconscious doesn't panic the way your ego does. It goes to work. It begins constructing the next version of your life out of the wreckage of the last one. And that construction takes time, which is why there's usually a long, agonizing stretch where nothing visible is happening, and you feel abandoned by your own future. That stretch is the part almost nobody understands. It feels like stagnation. It feels like you've been forgotten, like everyone else's life is moving forward while yours has stalled in some cosmic waiting room. But underneath, in the workshop, the most important work you'll ever undergo is happening at full speed. The stillness on the surface is the price of the movement underneath. Jung borrowed a concept from the old alchemists to describe this. He called the darkest phase the nigredo, the blackening, the necessary decomposition before anything new can be made. The alchemists understood that you cannot refine gold from raw ore without first breaking the ore down completely, and they knew that phase looked, from every angle, like ruin. Nothing about decomposition looks like progress. It looks like rot, but it's the exact condition required for what comes next. Here's the piece that should change how you see your current situation. The feeling that everything is about to work out tends to arrive at the end of the nigredo, not the middle. It shows up when the decomposition is nearly complete and the reassembly is about to begin. So if that feeling has been visiting you lately, flickering, tentative, easy to dismiss, it may be telling you that the worst of the breakdown is behind you, even though the visible rebuild hasn't started yet. That's why hope arrives when things still look dark. It's a leading indicator, running ahead of the evidence. Let me stay with the darkness for a moment, because I don't want to rush you past it the way the internet always does. There's a whole industry built on hurrying you out of discomfort. 3 steps to your best life. Manifest your dream reality in 30 days. Just raise your vibration. Jung would have looked at all of that with a kind of weary suspicion, because he understood that the ego is desperate to skip the difficult part, and these promises are custom-built to feed that desperation. The ego doesn't actually want transformation. It wants improvement without disruption. It wants to add good things to your existing life. Better job, better partner, more money, while leaving your fundamental structure untouched. What it fears more than almost anything is the one thing genuine change requires: a period where the old structure comes down and the new one hasn't gone up yet. That gap between the two is where the ego experiences something close to terror, because the ego survives on knowing. It needs a role, a plan, a story about where this is all heading. Take those away and it feels like dying. But that gap is exactly where the good part gets made. You cannot skip it. And the reason your life has felt so unbearable in this waiting period isn't that something has gone wrong. It's that you're standing in the one place the ego was built to avoid, and it's screaming at you to run back to whatever was familiar, even if what was familiar was quietly killing you. There's a principle Jung returned to again and again that explains why the turn, when it comes, so often comes right after the lowest point. He called it enantiodromia, a long word for a simple, almost cosmic pattern. Things tend to transform into their opposite at the moment of their greatest intensity. The night is darkest right before it breaks. The tide pulls out the furthest right before it turns and comes rushing back. A pendulum swings hardest in one direction at the exact instant it's about to reverse. He observed this in human lives constantly. The people who arrived at his door in the deepest despair, absolutely certain their story was over, were frequently the ones standing closest to their transformation. Their most complete sense of loss was often the immediate precursor to their most significant renewal. The intensity of the low was itself a sign of how much force was gathering for the turn. This is not the same as saying, things have to get worse before they get better, which is a cliché people use to sound wise. It's more precise than that. It's saying that psychic energy, when it's pushed as far as it can go in one direction, reaches a limit and then reverses on its own, not because you willed it, but because that's the nature of energy in the psyche. The exhaustion of one extreme creates the birth of its opposite. So, the bottom you may have hit, or feel you're hitting, might not be a pit you're trapped in. It might be the floor you needed to touch in order to push off. And the fact that you can now feel something stirring, this faint sense that the pressure is about to release, could be the first evidence that the reversal has already begun beneath the surface. Let me make this concrete because I don't want to leave you in the abstract. Picture someone who spent years trying to force a particular version of their life into existence. Maybe it was a career they'd invested everything in. Maybe a relationship they kept trying to fix. Maybe just an image of who they were supposed to become that they'd been chasing since they were young. They pushed, and for a while the pushing worked, or seemed to, and then it stopped working. The harder they tried, the more it slipped away. Eventually, they hit a wall so final that they had no choice but to stop. Not because they'd found peace, but because there was nothing left to try. The striving simply ran out of fuel. And in that exhausted stillness, with no plan and no fight left, something began to happen that all the effort had actually been blocking. Options they'd never considered started appearing at the edge of their vision. A different path. One they would have dismissed a year earlier as beneath them or off course, started to look, quietly, like home. That's enantiodromia in a life. The furious effort in one direction reached its limit, collapsed, and the collapse cleared space for the opposite to emerge. What looked like total defeat was the turning point. And here's the part that always startles people who've lived it. The new direction, the one that appeared only after they'd given up, usually turns out to be the one they were meant for all along. The old direction was the ego's plan. The new one was the self's. That word, the self, is worth slowing down on, because it's at the center of everything Jung believed about how lives work out. When he used it, he didn't mean your personality or your ego or the you that answers to your name. He meant something larger. The self, in his framework, is the deeper organizing center of the whole psyche, the part that holds the blueprint of who you actually are, beneath all the roles you learned to play, all the expectations you absorbed, all the survival strategies you mistook for personality. The ego is a small circle of light, the part of you that's conscious, that plans and worries and wants. The self is the entire field the light moves through, most of it in darkness, and it has an agenda that the ego often can't understand. It's oriented not toward comfort or safety or approval, but toward wholeness, toward you becoming the complete version of what you were always capable of being. And this is where everything working out takes on a completely different meaning than the one we started with. Because when you're waiting for things to work out, your ego has a very specific picture in mind. It wants the exact outcome it decided on. It wants the situation resolved in the particular shape it prefers. But the self isn't working toward the ego's picture. The self is working toward your wholeness, and those two things are frequently not the same. Which means that when your life finally turns, when the change you've been sensing finally breaks the surface, it will very likely not look like what you were waiting for. It might look, at first, like the opposite. The relationship you were praying would come back doesn't, and something healthier arrives in its place that you couldn't have received while you were still fixated on the old one. The career you were desperate to save falls apart, and out of that collapse comes work that fits the person you actually are, rather than the person you were performing. Jung watched this happen so many times that he came to trust it as a law of the inner life. What the self arranges is always bigger than what the ego asked for. But because it's bigger, and because it doesn't match the ego's narrow request, people often fail to recognize their prayers being answered. They're so busy grieving the specific thing they wanted that they can't see the larger thing arriving. They're looking for a door on the north wall, while the whole east side of the house opens onto a garden. So part of trusting that everything is about to work out means loosening your grip on your own definition of working out. The turn is coming, but it may not deliver the item you ordered. It may deliver something you didn't know how to want yet, something that a year from now you'll be grateful you didn't get the small thing you were begging for, because it would have kept you from the larger thing that was actually meant for you. If any of this is landing, if you're recognizing yourself in this description of the threshold, the exhaustion, the faint stirring of something new, you might find it useful to have a way of actually listening to what's forming beneath your awareness, instead of just waiting and hoping. That's what we built our guide, True Self-Discovery, for. It's 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's approach, designed for exactly this stretch, the in-between, where you can feel the pattern taking shape behind the loom, but can't yet see the front of it. It's a way to work with the process rather than white-knuckle your way through it. The link is right below this video. But stay with me, because there's something about how the outer world responds to this inner turn that I don't want you to miss. Once the reorganization inside you reaches a certain point, something remarkable tends to start happening in the world around you. Doors that were locked begin, inexplicably, to open. You think of someone you haven't spoken to in years, and they message you that afternoon. A conversation with a stranger hands you exactly the piece of information you needed. Opportunities cluster in a way that feels almost too on the nose to be random. Jung had a name for this, and it's probably his most misunderstood idea: synchronicity. Most people take it to mean meaningful coincidence and leave it there, treating it as a fun, mystical curiosity. But he meant something more precise and more useful. He was describing the way the inner and outer worlds seem to fall into alignment during periods of genuine psychological change, as if a shift in your inner state changes the kinds of events that gather around you. He wasn't claiming your thoughts magically summon reality like a vending machine. He was pointing at something subtler. When your inner life is reorganizing, when the self is moving you toward a new configuration, your attention changes. You start noticing things you were blind to before. You become available to opportunities you would have walked right past a month earlier. You give off a different signal in conversations, and people respond to it. And underneath all of that, there does seem to be a genuine patterning at work that Jung never fully explained and never pretended to, where outer events line up with inner readiness in ways that ordinary cause and effect can't quite account for. The practical upshot is this: when you start noticing meaningful coincidences clustering in your life, the right people, the strange timing, the doors swinging open, it's usually a sign that the inner turn has progressed far enough to begin expressing itself outwardly. The tapestry has been woven far enough that the picture is starting to bleed through to the front. Those coincidences aren't the universe rewarding your good attitude. They're the surface evidence of deep work that's nearly complete. And if you look back honestly at every major turn your life has already taken, you'll probably find a trail of these moments. The chance encounter that led to everything. The random detour that turned out to be the whole point. The thing you almost didn't do. At the time, it felt like luck. Looking back, It feels like something closer to design. That retrospective clarity, the way the pattern only becomes visible once you're past it, is the front of the tapestry finally coming into view. Now let me tell you how the new thing actually arrives, because Jung identified a specific mechanism for it, and understanding it can save you an enormous amount of suffering during the wait. He called it the transcendent function. It's clunky language, but the idea underneath it is one of the most important things he ever articulated. Here's the situation it describes. You're caught between two things that seem irreconcilable: the life you had and the life you can feel coming, what you want and what you're being asked to release. Two opposing pulls, and no way to satisfy both. The ego's instinct in this bind is to pick a side and force a resolution. Go back to the old thing, or leap blindly into some new thing before it's ready. Anything to end the unbearable tension of holding both at once. But Jung discovered that if you can tolerate the tension, if you can hold both opposites in your awareness without collapsing into either one, something extraordinary eventually happens. A third thing emerges. Not a compromise between the two, but an entirely new possibility that neither side could have produced alone. A door appears in a wall you'd stared at for months and swore was solid. The transcendent function is the psyche's way of generating genuine novelty, but it only fires when you've refused the easy exits. If you retreat to the old life, you never get it. If you bolt prematurely into a poorly formed new one, you never get it. It requires you to stand in the fire of not knowing long enough for the deeper mind to do its work and offer up something you couldn't have thought of on your own. This is why the waiting is not passive, even though it looks like it from the outside. Sitting in the threshold, holding the tension, resisting the urge to force a resolution. That is some of the hardest and most important work a person can do. It doesn't look like anything. To your family, to your friends, you might just look stuck. But you're not stuck. You're gestating. You're doing the invisible labor that has to happen before the visible change can arrive. And this reframes the delay you've been so frustrated by. That stretch of time where nothing seemed to happen, where you were doing everything right and getting nothing back, was not wasted. It was the incubation the new thing required. Nothing genuine can be rushed into existence. A field left fallow isn't a field failing to produce. It's a field restoring the fertility it will need to produce something worth having. Everything alive has a gestation period, and the bigger the thing being born, the longer the dark quiet that precedes it. So if your life has felt fallow, if you've been lying awake wondering why the good thing hasn't come yet, why others seem to move forward while you wait, consider the possibility that the length of the wait is proportional to the size of what's coming. The psyche doesn't put you through a long nigredo to produce something small. The decomposition is extensive because the reconstruction is significant. I want to name something you might be feeling right about now because it tends to rise up whenever hope starts returning. Fear. Specifically, the fear of hoping again. You've been let down before. You felt this exact feeling, that things were about to change, and then watched them not change, or change for the worse. So there's a protective part of you that treats hope itself as dangerous, as a setup for another fall. Better to expect nothing, that part reasons, so you can't be crushed again. Jung understood that instinct, and he'd tell you it's an old wound talking, not the truth of your situation. That protective part formed at some point when hoping actually did lead to pain, and it's been on guard ever since, mistaking every new possibility for the old threat. It confuses the future with the past. It's trying to keep you safe by keeping you small, and it will talk you out of your own life if you let it. But here's the difference between the false hope you felt before and what you might be feeling now. False hope is usually the ego wanting a specific outcome and convincing itself it's coming. It's loud, grasping, anxious, a demand dressed up as optimism. What Jung was describing is quieter than that. It's less a demand and more a recognition. It doesn't insist on a particular result. It simply senses that movement has begun, that the long stillness is ending, that something is turning. You can tell the difference by the texture. The false version is frantic. The real one is calm, almost solemn. And it doesn't need to argue with you. It just quietly persists. If the feeling you've been having lately is the calm kind, the kind that keeps returning without any obvious reason and doesn't need to convince you of a specific outcome, that's worth trusting. Not because trusting it guarantees anything, but because that particular quality of feeling tends to be your deeper self reporting on work you can't consciously see. Let me tell you what everything working out actually looks like from the inside once it does, because this is where the whole idea gets rescued from the shallow version everyone sells. The shallow version says you'll get what you want and then you'll be happy. Circumstances resolve, feelings follow. Jung found the real thing to be almost the reverse. What actually changes first, and most importantly, is your relationship to your own life. The people he watched come through this passage didn't primarily report that their external problems vanished. Some of their problems remained. What they reported was that something inside them had reorganized around a new center, that they felt rooted in a way they hadn't before, anchored to something underneath the shifting circumstances that couldn't be taken away by any particular outcome. They stopped living in that state of perpetual reaching, where okayness was always one achievement away, always contingent on the next thing arriving. They developed a felt sense of being fundamentally all right that didn't depend on the score. And from that place, this is the part that sounds paradoxical but shows up again and again. The external things they'd been straining for often started to arrive, precisely because they were no longer straining. The desperate energy that had been repelling opportunities relaxed, and the field opened. So, everything working out turns out to mean something deeper than you get your wish. It means you become a person for whom life works, someone whose inner alignment lets the outer pieces fall into place, someone who can meet whatever comes without being destroyed by it, because their center no longer lives out in their circumstances. The outcomes still matter, but they stop being the thing your entire sense of self is staked on. And that shift, more than any single event, is what people mean when they look back and say, that was when everything changed. Jung called the whole lifelong movement toward this state individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, of integrating all the scattered and rejected parts of yourself into a coherent whole, with the self at the center rather than the anxious, grasping ego. It's not a destination you reach and then relax into forever. It's a direction, a lifelong turning toward your own wholeness. But there are moments in a life where that process makes a great leap forward, where a lot of quiet, accumulated work suddenly crystallizes into a new way of being. And those leaps almost always happen right after the periods that felt most like falling apart. This is why he could look at someone in the middle of what appeared to be a collapse and see, instead, a threshold. He wasn't being naively optimistic. He'd simply watched the pattern enough times to recognize the shape of it. The breakdown was the individuation accelerating. The falling apart was the reorganization in progress. And the person, terrified and certain their life was ending, was actually closer than they had ever been to it truly beginning. Let me give you the signs that this is happening in you right now, because they're specific, and because they're so easy to misread as symptoms of something going wrong. The first is that things you used to care about have started to lose their grip. Goals that once drove you feel strangely hollow. Ambitions that used to burn now flicker. This can feel alarming, like you're losing your motivation or becoming depressed. But often it's the psyche withdrawing its energy from an old configuration because it's preparing to redirect that energy somewhere new. The sap is pulling back from the old branches. It's not gone. It's relocating. The second sign is a pull towards solitude, a need to withdraw from the noise, from people, from the constant performance of being fine. This too gets misread, by you and by everyone around you, as isolation or withdrawal in the negative sense. But transformation requires enormous internal resources, and the psyche often pulls energy back from external engagement to fund the work happening inside. Your need for quiet during this period is as legitimate as a body's need for sleep while it's healing. The third sign is vivid dreams, strange thoughts, memories surfacing from long ago, emotions rising that don't seem attached to anything in your present life. Jung would read all of this as the unconscious becoming more active, pushing material up toward the surface because the old lid, the old identity that kept everything suppressed, is loosening. It's messy and disorienting, but it's a sign of movement, of the deep water beginning to stir. The fourth sign is the one we started with, that recurring, quiet, hard-to-justify sense that something is about to change. If it keeps returning despite your attempts to talk yourself out of it, if it survives your cynicism, your fear of hoping, your long history of disappointment, that persistence is itself significant. The ego's fantasies are fragile. They collapse under scrutiny. Something that keeps returning after you've argued with it and dismissed it tends to be coming from a deeper place. If several of these are true for you at once, you're not falling apart, and you're not fooling yourself. You're standing in the threshold. You're behind the loom, staring at the knots, and the picture is closer to complete than the tangle in front of you suggests. So what do you actually do with all this? Because I know that just trust the process can sound like the most useless advice ever handed to a person in pain. Let me be more concrete than that. The first thing is to stop forcing. This is counterintuitive because everything in our culture tells us that if we want things to change, we have to grind harder. But there's a specific kind of forcing that actively blocks the transcendent function from doing its work. The frantic, grasping effort to control an outcome that hasn't formed yet. When you're in the gestation period, forcing is like digging up a seed every few days to check whether it's growing. The checking kills the growing. Some things require you to leave them in the dark and let them do what they do. This doesn't mean go passive and wait for lightning. It means shift the quality of your effort. Stop straining toward the specific outcome your ego demands, and instead, pay attention. Show up for the small next thing in front of you. Follow the quiet pulls, the conversation you feel drawn to have, the direction that keeps whispering, the option you dismissed too quickly. The self communicates through these pulls, and your job isn't to override them with your master plan. Your job is to notice them and cooperate. The second thing is to hold the tension without collapsing it. When the discomfort of not knowing gets unbearable, and it will, resist the urge to end it by either retreating to the old life or lunging at some half-formed new one just to make the uncertainty stop. Stay in the middle a little longer than feels tolerable. That's where the third thing gets born. Every time you refuse the easy exit and stay in the fire, you're strengthening the exact capacity that lets the new possibility emerge. The third thing is to pay attention to your dreams and your inner life, because they're where the reorganization announces itself first. You don't need to become an expert interpreter. You just need to treat what surfaces from the deep as information rather than noise. The emotions that rise, the images that recur, the memories that won't leave you alone. They're the workshop showing you pieces of what it's making. When you learn to listen to them instead of dismissing them, you stop being a bystander to your own transformation and start participating in it. And the fourth thing, the hardest and most important, is to trust that the length and difficulty of what you've been through is proportional to what's being built. Not as a platitude, but as something Jung observed across a great many lives. The people who came through the deepest passages came into the largest renewals. The size of the darkness told them something about the size of what was coming. Your long wait was not you being forgotten. It was the fallow field restoring itself for a harvest that a shorter, easier season could never have produced. I want to come back to that image of the loom because I think it holds the whole thing. Right now you're behind it. You see the tangle, the knots, the threads that seem to go nowhere, the colors that don't appear to belong together. From where you stand, it's easy to believe the whole thing is a mess, that your life is a botched piece of work, that all the loose ends will stay loose forever. But every thread you can see back there corresponds to something on the front. The knot that looks like a mistake is holding a crucial part of the image in place. The color that seems out of place is exactly what the pattern needed. The stretch where nothing seemed to connect was the loom being set for the section that would finally make the whole picture make sense. You've been judging the tapestry from the only side you've ever been able to see, and it's the side that always looks like chaos. Jung's entire body of work is, in a sense, an argument that there's a front to the loom, that the psyche is oriented toward meaning and wholeness, that the mess has a pattern behind it even when you can't perceive it, that the parts of your life that seem most like waste and dead end are load-bearing threads in something coherent. He didn't arrive at this through wishful thinking. He arrived at it by walking through his own long darkness, and by sitting with hundreds of people through theirs, and watching, again and again, the tangle resolve into an image once enough time had passed for them to step around to the front. You will step around to the front. That's not a promise about a specific outcome, because I can't tell you what your particular pattern will turn out to be. But it is a promise about the nature of the process you're in. The feeling you've been having, that quiet, stubborn sense that something is turning, is you catching the first glimpse of the front of the weave. It's your deeper self reporting that the work is nearly far enough along to show. And here's the thing about a turn. You only ever recognize it clearly in hindsight. While you're in it, it just feels like more of the same difficult, uncertain stretch you've been enduring. There's no bell that rings, no announcement, no moment where the sky opens and confirms that yes, this is the beginning of everything working out. It arrives disguised as an ordinary Tuesday. It arrives as a small decision, a conversation you almost skipped, a direction you took because the old one had finally closed. Only later, looking back, do you see that ordinary moment for what it was, the hinge on which your whole life swung. So you won't get the confirmation you're waiting for before you have to trust. That's the deal. The trust comes first, in the dark, before the evidence. And the fact that you can feel it at all, this returning sense that the tide is about to turn, is more evidence than most people ever get. It's the psyche leaning ahead of the moment, telling you what it knows before your circumstances have caught up. Everything working out was never going to look like the sky opening. It was always going to look like this, a long darkness that finally, quietly, starts to lift. A tangle that begins, thread by thread, to resolve. A person who, without quite being able to explain why, starts to sense that the worst is behind them and something they can't yet see is on its way. You're standing at that turn right now, not at the end of your story, in the middle of its most important chapter, the one where the breakdown becomes the beginning, where the waiting reveals its purpose, where the person you were quietly becoming all along finally steps into the light. The threads are almost all in place, the picture is almost through to the front, and the feeling you've been afraid to trust is the truest thing you've felt in a long time. Stay in it. Keep showing up for the small next thing. Follow the quiet pulls. Hold the tension a little longer than feels bearable. And trust that the deeper part of you, the part that never stopped working even when you were certain you'd been abandoned, knows exactly what it's making. You just can't see the front of it yet, but you will. And when you do, you'll understand why it had to be woven exactly this way. Every knot, every loose end, every long, dark stretch that felt like nothing was happening at all. If you want a way to actually hear what your deeper self is building during this stretch, to stop guessing at the pattern and start participating in it, that's what we made True Self-Discovery for. 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's work, built for exactly this kind of threshold, when you can feel the turn coming and you're looking for a way to work with it instead of just holding your breath until it arrives. It's a way of stepping a little closer to the front of the loom. You'll find the link right below this video.